Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you to be part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the LinkedIn live video feed, a link to which I'll now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone to say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guest is Dr. Francesca Royster, Professor of English at DePaul University and author of Black Country Music, Listening for Revolutions, which will be the subject of tonight's show. We're also pleased to be joined by Dr. Philip Auslander, Professor of Performance Studies and Popular Musicology at Georgia Tech.
Yeah. Hey, take it. Get it. Take it. Get it. Yeah. Hey, take it. Get it. Out. Hey, take it. Yeah. Hey, take it. Get it. Yeah.
Professor Royster, welcome.
Thank you, Simeon. I'm so glad to be here.
Could you tell us, when I was first introduced to you, it was by way of a colleague of yours who's a musicologist. Only later I found out you're a professor of English. Tell us, how did you get interested in performance studies and popular musicology?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about my journey. It's been a little wandering, but I started out as an academic who studied Shakespeare studies and really interested in live Shakespearean productions and issues of race. But at the same time, I grew up in a really musical household. My dad's a percussionist. My mom was really interested in African dance and music, and we just had a lot of musical instruments and albums around the house. And so music was always a really important part of our lives. And so when I was working on Shakespeare studies, when I was writing my dissertation, I had this file on my computer called the Tina Eartha Grace Project. And it was like this place where I would put all the things about Tina Turner, Eartha Kitt, and Grace Jones, because they were people that I loved. And I knew that at some point I really wanted to write about them. But I also was really compelled by Shakespeare studies, and it's, if you've ever read Shakespearean scholarship, it's just a very complex and compelling world that could keep your attention for a lifetime. But eventually I really, I think by reading some performance studies scholars who were giving me a way to think about like the place of art in the outside world, and like what some people call world making. And I'm thinking about like the work of Jill Dolan and others. I started really thinking about like the whys of studying performance and what draws us socially and personally to art, and the possibility of making change. And so music felt like a really natural way of talking about that and talking about fandom, because it's in some ways even more accessible. Shakespeare's pretty accessible, I think, ultimately, but music is an even more potentially accessible way of talking about how we consume art on an everyday level and how it's so saturated and is part of our lives. So I started going to conferences like the American Musicology Society and to other organizations where I could also talk about music and performance. And the Pop Music Conference is a really great place to meet people. I started reading people like um, Hanif Abdurraqib, who is an amazing writer from Columbus, and um, writes about the intersections between race and social justice, and is a great storyteller and uses a really compelling personal voice. Daphne Brooks is someone who I love to read, and Phil's work. I love his book on glam rock as a big David Bowie fan. So at any rate, I started reading and really thinking about different styles and ways to kind of capture the role of music in everyday life. And so that's kept me going for a long time, for a long time now. And I've been really writing about music for the last 15 years of my scholarly life. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, and Phil, Professor Auslander, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about your journey? As I understand, you too started out in the world of theater, and now and of course you are professor of performance studies and popular musicology. Do you recognize in yourself a little bit about what Professor Royster is talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I too was, I got into music in large part because I just love it. I'm a fan. I'm a listener. Um, the one thing I would say for me though is that I was actually, and I don't know, maybe Francesca can connect to this, but I was actually kind of reluctant to sort of go public with my interest in popular music. And I did a lot of other things in terms of what I was writing about and publishing and so on before I finally devoted a chapter to music and other stuff, related stuff, in the first edition of my book, Liveness. And so that was kind of the moment when I kind of let the world know that this was something I was interested in. And I've just been pursuing it ever since. Also because at the time, which is quite a long time ago now, I really felt that performance studies was negligent in its failure to treat musical performance. And so to me, that was a gap that needed to be addressed. And I've done some work since to try to address it. And I'm pleased to say that a lot of other people by now have kind of come into it and are doing it in their own ways. And so we finally do have a decent body of literature and scholarship around musical performance within the context of performance studies.
And maybe I can continue with you, Professor Auslander. Do you think that exclusivity of musicology or music from the domain of performance studies, does that come from this legacy of classical music, and that of reading the notes and the idea of kind of the deep personification of music, of the idea that, okay, music is something that happens or great music happens in the ether, there's nothing human about it? Is that pretty much what's changed over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I will just say that when I first kind of got interested in this, I did ask a prominent senior performance studies scholar why performance studies wasn't paying attention to music. And he said, oh, because it's too technical. You have to know all that stuff, all that technical stuff to get into it, which to me was a very odd response, as if theater and other kinds of performance have no technical stuff you need to get to know. But but that was, yeah, but it was that. It was this sort of idea of, oh no, we can't touch that. That's this rarefied, thing. And then on the other side of it, for me at the time, also, I was looking, the one field outside of musicology that was looking at quite a lot of popular music was cultural studies. But for me, the problem with that was that cultural studies was all about reception. It was all about audiences and how audiences use music, which is very important. I mean, that's not something I dismiss at all. But that would seem to be kind of the exclusive focus of those folks. And so what I really wanted to be doing was to be looking at performers as musicians as performers, which wasn't really happening exactly in either of those places. So that's why I jumped in as I did.
Okay, and Professor Royster, does that ring a bell? And how has your experience been? As you said, you've been working now more or less going into this field of musicology for the past decade. How has the reception been there? How have you worked and collaborated with people, so-called official musicologists?
Well, I definitely approach it with some humbleness, as someone who, whose training isn't in like deeply in musicology and music theory. I have like some really basic knowledge. I play a few instruments, not very well. So, in some ways, as an outsider to some of the big debates around what musicology should be, or what the canons of musicology are, I can kind of slip in and out. And sometimes I have to take responsibility for, what I don't know. But my approach, especially post tenure, let's put it that way, is to be more exploratory and curious, and to like seek out teachers and to try to learn more about those arguments. But I was just reading a really wonderful manuscript by a new scholar in musicology. And sometimes it's really through my role in as a mentor to younger scholars that I get the graduate education that I never got, in musicology and what those debates are. So yeah, I think that it's interesting. Like I am very interested also in persona, along with Dr. Auslander, and really thinking about the agency of the artist, as well as kind of the techniques of performance, and embodiment, all those things. But I am also interested in fandom, and I found that like Christopher Small's idea of musicking is so helpful in terms of expanding beyond a textual approach to music, to think about all of the different relations that are summoned when music is played or performed. And that might actually betray my own cultural studies roots too. So but I guess I can enter into it. I kind of enter into it with the knowledge that I might be stepping on some landmines as I go blithely along. But I think being curious and trying to keep different disciplines in conversation in my writing is my best strategy for kind of swerving some of those debates.
Sounds like a healthy scholarly attitude. Great. So this brings us to our first roundtable, which is, what is country and Western music? Professors Royster and Auslander, we have all heard of the music genre country and Western, but it would be good to have a little background information about it. What is it? Where does it come from? And what are the limits between country and Western and other genres? Can we start with you, Professor Royster?
Sure. Okay, we'll talk about landmines. This is a topic that is really important to my book, partly because of the ways that I think the boundaries and gatekeeping of what is considered country and Western music is so fraught, and really, I think, racially determined. And I see like a really important moment for the discussion of country and Western music as a distinct thing. The moment in the early 1920s when popular music was beginning to be marketed and in very segregated terms. So there were artists who were making blues, or what we call now blues, country blues, string band music, and other kinds of folk musical forms that were then kind of separated into markets and one of the markets was called hillbilly music. And later, I think out of some pressure and embarrassment, country and Western eventually kind of evolved as the marketing term. But that term, and that term definitely speaks to particular kinds of styles of music, the use of instruments like the fiddle, the banjo, the guitar, the lap steel string guitar, bottleneck guitar, like different playing styles. But at the same time, the desire to kind of keep that genre distinct has sometimes been, I think, more socially determined than determined by the form. And another idea about country and Western music that distinguishes it, that I love, even as it sometimes doesn't really work, is this idea that country and Western or country music is about three chords and the truth, this idea of honest expression, authenticity. But even those terms, I think, have to be kind of looked at critically to think about, what exactly is an authentic performance? How does that connect to ideas or fantasies about a particular region or a moment in the past? So anyway, so as I think about those definitions, I like to think about the particular instrumentation, really the influence of lots of different cultures, including African American, Irish, Hawaiian, Latin American, Mexican, and a Mexican American influence, all these different styles that have gone into country music as we hear it now. And really to kind of see those definitions as a starting point for conversation. And really, like, in studying the music that I got most excited about for the book, realizing that it's really how those genres and sounds can overlap to create new sounds. I think that's where the really exciting music is happening. So that's my own take on it.
Great. And Professor Auslander, Three Chords and the Truth, it makes me think of the second edition of your book Liveness, in which you talk about this Neil Young, tonight, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Tonight's the Night song about a groupie of a rock band who, after the band performs that evening, he takes out the guitar with his tired voice and he sings, and nothing was closer to rock music than that. So tell us, what is your response to Professor Royster and her description of country music?
That is Neil Young, by the way. I totally agree. I guess I'll take a slightly different angle on it, though, because I think that one of the things that I do find interesting is the way the genre has changed names over time, and certainly the big changes from hillbilly to country and Western, then to country, because the Western has sort of dropped out of this by now. And then there was a brief moment in the 1940s when country music was called folk music, also, in terms of Billboard charts and things like that. It was sort of a transition between hillbilly and country and Western, which I also find interesting, because that evocation of folk, I think, is interesting, in terms of the ideology behind all of this. But the other thing I want to say is that this is also, or going hand in hand with this change of name, is also a change of what I see as the normative persona of country music. So the hillbilly image was the normative persona in the 20s or 30s or whatever, and then that kind of gradually transitioned to a cowboy image. That's where the country and Western comes from. But in the 30s, 40s, and even well up till today, I mean, if you're a country musician, you still have to wear a cowboy hat, right? That side of, or that version of the country music persona really took over. And to a large extent, where that came from was actually Hollywood movies. because country musicians were embarrassed at a certain point by being called hillbillies or playing into that image. And they saw, these movies, singing cowboys in the movies, and they thought, oh, that's a much better, more glamorous image. And so they sort of gravitated toward that. Not all did, but many became sort of the normative persona at that point. But there's a very famous book. I'm sorry, I'm getting old and my memory is not that great, but there's a very famous book by Peterson, sociologist, right, about country music, which is called something like Manufacturing Authenticity or something
Yes.
along those lines. Yeah, and it's a detailed description of sort of how the Nashville establishment creates ideas of authenticity and markets them essentially. So yeah, the truth, the three chords and the truth, I don't know, it's a pretty manufactured truth when you get right down to it. And although I totally agree, I mean, country music probably of all the different genres, is the one that is most deeply invested in gatekeeping, and shoring up the boundaries around what is and what isn't country music. And that's been historically true. Well, at least probably since post-war, more or less, post-World War II, and certainly remains that way to this very day. But at the same time, this is, I think, where the thing about manufacturing authenticity comes in. Country music has also always admitted a few people who don't really belong, strictly speaking, right? So, I mean, if you're to be an authentic, supposedly, ostensibly authentic country music artist, you have to be white, you have to be from the South, you have to be working class, or you have to appear to be all these things, right?
Mhm.
And so, someone I like to talk about in this context is Keith Urban, who isn't American at all, let alone from the South. He's from New Zealand. And yet, when he sings, he sounds as if he's an American from the South. Not when he speaks, but when he sings. And so, there's always this possibility of sort of fudging the requirements for authenticity, which allow a few people to kind of have allowed a few people to kind of sneak in under the wire, so to speak.
Okay, so before we get into musical persona, which will be our next roundtable, we have the roundtable. Does music unite people or does music divide people? In the introduction to Black country music, Professor Royster describes her journey as a Black lesbian woman with dreadlocks into a country music summer festival in downtown Chicago. The Windy City Smokeout, as the festival was called, took place in Chicago's West Loop, the streets of which are bustling with all different kinds of Black people. Yet, as expected, the festival grounds formed a cultural barrier to all Black attendees. As Professor Royster gives her entrance ticket to the two handsome young Black men at the festival gate, it becomes clear to them that even though she is in the Black space of downtown Chicago, she is stepping into the musical space of country and Western, which is white, conservative, and straight-haired. As the two men take her ticket, and she takes a small step and giant leap from West Loop Chicago into country and Western music, they glance at each other to say, she's weird. She writes, quote, "Sorry, I'm just here for the barbecue." That's what Black person after Black person told me when I came up to ask them what it is like to be one of the few Black people at the Windy City Smokeout, a country music and barbecue fest in Chicago's West Loop, one Sunday afternoon in early July 2014. The question that I wanted to ask the scattered Black people that I saw, why do you like country music? Why are you here? Are the ones that I was also reflecting on for myself, end quote. So Professors Royster and Auslander, what the heck happened? How do you explain the phenomenon that Professor Royster experienced at the Downtown Country Music Festival in her native Chicago? Would Professor Auslander experience the same thing had he showed up at a hip hop or R&B music festival at the exact same geographic location? Does music unite people or does it divide them? Professor Royster?
Wow. Well, I think that part of the answer has to kind of consider the festival's place in Chicago, because Chicago is such a an interestingly rich, like such a rich place. It actually has a place of like country music production itself. At least it used to, when the National Barn Dance, I think, was broadcast from Chicago. So there is like this country music institution that's connected to Chicago, and lots of folks who have migrated, African American and white, to Chicago's North Side. So the presence of country is still there, and there's a country bar that's just about a mile away from my house on the north side of Chicago, which is actually a very awkward place to visit. So, so given that Chicago itself is also a very segregated place, that feeling of surveillance wasn't entirely new to me as a native Chicagoan. There are spaces in Chicago that where, you know, I'm stared at, or where people are like, what is she doing there? So I think some of that feeling at the festival really connects to this particular place and to the particular history of Chicago. But I think that I just can't ignore the ways that it also is reflecting this idea that country music is like the natural domain of white listeners, and where white people and find their own stories. And so that was in some ways kind of felt even when I walked in, both by the gate, the African American gatekeepers, but also by the music itself that was playing, which was Leonard Skinner's "Sweet Home Alabama," which is a song that always makes me uncomfortable but I've also looked into the history of that song, and how for Leonard Skinner, it might have meant one thing. For the African American backup singers who contribute a powerful part of the song, it meant maybe a political opposite of what the song meant in terms of claiming home. So, but hearing that music made me think about, like, what am I doing here, and do I belong? And I think that the experience that I felt there of Black people feeling like not really wanting to talk about the complexity, the political complexity of their place there, is just consistent, I think, with the feeling of a festival wanting to relax, wanting to maybe not think about the politics of the music, or even eating barbecue. Like, barbecue itself has a fraught racial history. So it was like a country music and barbecue fest. So there were just so many layers going on. But I think part of what was happening in my movement through that space was also, you know, that I was in this place of leisure, and I wanted to talk about serious things. But I think also, yeah, these other layers of history were following us as well.
Professor Auslander, so your colleague with whom we have already done another show together, Julio Mendivil of the University of Vienna, he, I remember, gave a course on world music, and he was saying that he was asked by a World Music Festival organizer with another ethnomusicologist to put together the bands, and they were explaining to the presenter that, you know, you can't just put any music, because it affects some music. Certain people just don't belong there. They don't want to take part in it. They don't feel at home. And she said, no, music, it's a universal language. It brings everyone together. And they were saying, no, it actually pushes people away as much as it brings them together. And then he even gave the example of the Schlager music that he's researched, which is the German popular music post World War II. And that when he would be at a party, he'd put it on. He was with other academics, and then they would say, no, not that music. Don't put that music on. So, I mean, what is your reaction to all of this?
Well, that last thing just speaks to the idea. I mean, in the academic context, you know, that there's popular music that's worthy of study, and there's still popular music that isn't, at least according to, you know, some people. I mean, anyway, but I actually completely agree with the proposition that music both unites and divides, right? Although I would also say that, in my view, music per se doesn't do either of those things. Rather, it has to do with what Professor Royster was talking about: what happens when music becomes social, right? And And in fact, just to go back to the history for a minute, in terms of the way in which the music industry worked in, let's say, the 1930s and 40s, you had a sort of cadre of professional songwriters, and you had people called song pluggers whose job was to sell their songs to recording artists. And in order to maximize exposure and profit, they would sell these songs to artists in different genres. So you would have the same song being recorded, as a race record, as a country music record, hillbilly record, as a mainstream pop record, as a swing record, right? And so the genre and everything that goes along with it is not encoded into the music as such, right? That's a social construction of the music, a particular social construction of the music, and those social constructions, you know, people gravitate to them, and they become a part of the way in which they define themselves. And in any process of defining yourself, you are also defining how you are different from others. So it's always it's simultaneous gesture of inclusion and exclusion, right?
Mm.
The definition is always inclusive, and it's always inclusive of people who gravitate toward this, and then exclusive of those who don't, right? And how fiercely policed that is depends on the genre. Country music is not the only one to police it fairly fiercely, but that's so institutionalized in country music that it's quite distinctive. Um, okay, I'll stop.
And Professor
And,
Auslander, have you had that experience that you've been to, I don't know, some kind of place where you really, were
Well,
the only white
I
person?
don't
Or
actually had the experience, but the question made me remember something, which is I live in Georgia, and I don't know if it still exists, but years ago I knew that there was a place just kind of up the road from where I live, which is an informal, well, not a semi-formal kind of country music, country and bluegrass music venue that some people just run. They have a big barn out in their property and they just run it. But I couldn't go because my hair is too long.
mm,
Okay. So there you go. I mean, the
yeah.
answer is yes. I don't know about hip hop or, R&B or those, Chicago. I don't know. But I do know that there certainly are musical spaces where the people don't want me there, right? For whatever reason.
okay, fantastic. Professor Royster, did you want to follow up on that?
Oh, I was just going to say that, that it's like kind of going with this idea of music as being social, and that it really is a reflection of those histories, like current and past, that determine comfort level. Um, like thinking about how country music has been a soundtrack for some really explicitly racially violent acts, in the United States, like KKK rallies, or I'm not saying all country music, but there is like a literal, it's not a fantasy of of violence. It actually, and some of the roots of country also include coon songs that are like telling stories of lynchings. Like you can find in the history of this form stories that are very much anti-Black. So in terms of like thinking about the discomfort, it's both like the discomfort of people protecting the social boundaries of the present, but also a form that has sometimes been used and weaponized, against people for violence. So I just wanted to put that in there, and also to mention this wonderful fan and organizer, Holly G, who has created an alternative space among many for country music, called the Black Opera Review. And part of her impetus for doing this is her own experience of moving in spaces, kind of mainstream country music spaces, and feeling like she doesn't belong or that she shouldn't be there, and really kind of fearing for her safety. And so this is like the Black Opera Review is a concert that is kind of traveling all over the country, and sometimes the musicians reflect like folks from the area, like the one that was here in Chicago reflected people in Indiana, Illinois, primarily Indiana and Illinois, but it's just a really wonderful way also to create a space for African-American performers in this genre, and to be on stage with other Black performers, I think is also a place of safety.
Okay, let's move on to our second roundtable. This is, our third roundtable, and it is country and Western musical personae. And to take a look at this, we are going to, first of all, take a look at a very interesting video. It's a music video for Burger King.
When my belly starts a rumbling and I'm jonesing for a treat, I close my eyes for a big surprise, the tender crisp bacon cheddar ranch. I love the tender crisp bacon cheddar ranch, the breasts they grow on trees, and streams of bacon ranch dressing flow right up to your knees. There's tumbleweeds of bacon and cheddar paves the streets. Folks don't front you cause you got the juice. There's a train of ladies coming with a nice caboose. Never get in trouble, never need an excuse. That's the tender crisp bacon cheddar ranch. I love the tender crisp bacon cheddar ranch. No one tells you to behave. Your wildest fantasies come true. Dallas cheerleaders give you shaves. Red onions make you laugh instead, and french fries grow like weeds. You get the veg all day, all the lotto tickets paid. There's a king who wants you to have it your way. That's the tender crisp bacon cheddar ranch.
Wow. Okay. So in chapter 2 of Black Country Music, Professor Royster details the musical persona of Darius Rucker, whom we've just seen in that video, an alternative rock star who is now a successful country musician. Rucker is described as a genuinely talented, hardworking, and affable Black man who grew up in South Carolina as part of a predominantly white cultural sphere. To his detractors, Rucker's musical persona seems to perfectly fit the disparaging and offensive appellation, quote unquote, Oreo, as he has Black features on the outside, but is culturally white, of the white middle class on the inside. Professor Royster, who champions Rucker, describes his personal musical persona as, quote unquote, bro, writing, quote, I see in Rucker's friendly amiability the consummate bro. As a bro, Rucker has found a register through which he can safely navigate these sometimes treacherous waters of racial mixing as both a buddy and a conduit to censored feelings and emotions, end quote. Professor Royster describes his circle of friends by writing, quote, Rucker has performed for Barack Obama, hangs out with the football player Dan Marino and the NBA star Dirk Nowitzki, and is a close buddy to Tiger Woods, end quote. Professor Royster describes another aspect of his musical persona by writing, quote, in 2005, 3 years before he would launch his wildly successful country music career, the Hootie and the Blowfish frontman, Darius Rucker, appeared in a Burger King commercial for the tender crisp chicken bacon cheddar ranch sandwich. Natalie dressed as a Black cowboy, Tex Ritter style, complete with acoustic guitar, purple rhinestone shirt, white hat, and white cravat. Rucker performs in earnest and a little goofily. Rucker plays the straight man of sorts, while perhaps serving as an object of desire himself, the promise of his own compact, muscular body still contained by the taboo role of Black and country, but waiting to be discovered, unwrapped and undone, at least in the world of fantasy, end quote. So Professors Royster and Auslander, let's start with you, Professor Auslander. What makes up a musical persona, and how can we grasp and appreciate the musical persona of Darius Rucker?
What makes up a musical persona? Well, I mean, I look at musical, okay, so musical persona is sort of the identity of the performer, okay, as a performer. And this is not necessarily the identity of the person as a human being, okay? It is an identity constructed and assumed for the purpose of performing music. And it is certainly my contention that all musicians in all genres have such a thing, you know, develop a persona, and that in some ways it's actually a requisite, really, for being a performing musician to do this. And the question of what this involves really depends on the genre or the type of music that you're talking about. And some genres or varieties of music are very explicit and restrictive in their rules as to what constitutes a valid persona for the genre. Like symphony orchestras, for example, is an example of very, very restricted. I mean, I once stumbled on a document, which is a contractual document for a symphony orchestra in the United States, which has a very, very detailed explication of how the performers must dress, okay, down to their socks, right? So that's one dimension that, appearance, dress, costume is one dimension of the communication of a musical persona. And in some cases like that one, it's very, very clearly and restrictively defined. In other cases, of course, it's much more open-ended. And I also contend that for any genre, there's a kind of normative persona, sort of the ideal in a way of what such a musician looks like and performs like and sounds like and everything like. But then there are always, there's this some degree of deviation from that norm. And the question is kind of what degree is tolerable within the context of the genre, and at what point have you sort of exited that context through morphing the persona a little bit too much or something. uh I defer to Professor Royster's analysis of Darius Rucker's persona because I haven't really thought about it in a kind of holistic way. I mean, I was interested to discover that we have each written an analysis of his wagon wheel video, which are somewhat different from one another. But that's kind of as far as I went with in looking. I was really just interested in the way in which his persona was constructed in that one video, and I haven't given enough thought to the bigger picture to really offer a decent comment on that.
Professor Royster?
Sure. Well, I mean, I love thinking about Darius Rucker and his persona because to me, I mean, this commercial is like a really kitschy, goofy version of it, but it to me kind of thinks about how it makes me think about how for Black performers and Black male performers and public figures, there is like this toolbox or canon of images that are offered up by our culture as appropriate, and that you can kind of see, I think, in this performance and to some extent, in other public performances for Rucker, him kind of taking from this toolbox, but also like, combining things and making things anew. So I think that like when Professor Auslander is talking about musical persona, is really thinking about the moment of performance, of musical performance. My own discussion, including this commercial, is also thinking about the ways that for Rucker, I think it's important to think about how he moves through public space, in a commercial, although he's also singing, or, on a public appearance like the Today Show, or, how the kinds of charities that he's associated with, or other ways that are kind of part of his, I guess, what Richard Dyer would call like his star text. So it's kind of thinking about his music and his videos and all these other ways that he's creating celebrity. And I drew a lot when I was thinking about him, because I had in mind kind of this critique of him as an Oreo, and I just didn't want to go there. Like I felt like, okay, what right am I to say that? Like that doesn't tell me anything new. But what I wanted to think about was Daphne Brooks' concept of Afro-alienation, to think about the ways that masks and images that are very self-protective and maybe sometimes feel static are protecting our forms of armor for moving through fraught spaces like racist spaces, or places where judgment, violence, censure, punishment, all those things are kind of happening. So I wanted to think about Rucker that way. And unfortunately, I feel like I don't really know like the true motivation of Darius Rucker. So I might need to just talk to him, which, someday maybe I'll get to do that. But in terms of that star text, I thought it was interesting in light of the fraught history of country music and just the pressure to that at least up until the point that Rucker was starting country, there was really seemed to be only room for maybe one or two Black country music artists at a time. And, there's a sense of like very narrow lines in terms of what you could do and musically and otherwise to keep the ear of radio stations and to keep your contract. And there definitely have been, in the history, people who have lost their contracts or who've been told that their music isn't playable or wouldn't attract country music listeners, like someone like Ray Charles when he first made his Modern Sounds on Country Music album in the early 1960s. He was originally told that even though it was an album of country music covers, that it wasn't playable on country stations because artists would know that he was Black. And, a few years after that, when Charlie Pride was looking for a contract and a way to play country music, and eventually got a contract with RCA Records, he was often encouraged to make jokes about his race and to kind of undersell the fact that of his Blackness. And, writers were often commenting on the fact that Charlie Pride sounded white, quote unquote. So, so this is the history that Darius Rucker is entering into. And I think that, he seems very savvy. When I write about him as a bro, I'm really interested in this idea of like masculine tenderness and connection that that can be a way of also being safe, but also being connected. And definitely I think in his music, like I find in his voice and in his performance, that those moments of sincerity or vulnerability perhaps in his sound are also kind of contributing to this idea of the bro, of this place where men and women can kind of listen and connect and feel some sort of emotional experience through his voice.
And
That was a lot. Sorry.
no, it was perfect. So maybe while Professor Auslander is still thinking about his follow-up, his response, could you also tell us about this, this difference with the country music versus, I mean, I keep thinking about, Tupac Shakur or something. Saw this movie from 1993, Poetic Justice, and the way that Tupac Shakur, the Black rapper, he interacts with the white people is very hostile, very aggressive. Even a policeman comes up to him and he pushes the white policeman away. And it seems to me that what you're talking, those differences in musical persona are also very maybe present in country music. They treat each other differentially, right? People are about getting along, whereas with maybe then a different genre of music is more about being confrontational. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Like I'm thinking about Rucker's appearances on the Grand Ole Opry or other kinds of performances where he's performing with white performers. He often, is very physically affectionate, amiable, open, lots of laughter. Like there's definitely not the masked, hard persona of Tupac, although, that too is a performance. But yeah, the whole strategy of being in an interracial or primarily white space is really different when you compare the two of them. And I think it fits well with what to evoke William Peterson again, like the idea of soft shell country music, the ways that a certain kind of ease and cosmopolitanism and kind of friendly warmth is kind of part of the image of country music that he's entering into, and country masculinity that might be a little different from like a tougher kind of outlaw performance of country, or a performance that's really focusing on hard times, suffering, kind of hard lessons won and carried with you, like the image of the outlaw. So there is also within country a version of how to perform and how to be acceptable and authentic that Rucker is part of. That's also like in some ways a useful strategy for a Black artist who's trying to break into a very, very heavily protected genre like country music.
Fantastic. And I'd like to note also that on the show, we've had the privilege of hosting professional bull riders. And what was so incredible in connection with our show here is that the cowboys, they are, I mean, incredibly charming. And they are, they treat each other and everybody with such grace. I mean, they're the most charming people you've ever met. Phil, so your response?
There seems to be like a lot of things to talk about here. So one thing I just wanted to say is that when I was reading Professor Royster's chapter on Darius Rucker, and also some of the things she just said, I started to think about other cases. Like I was thinking particularly about Jimi Hendrix, who also had to negotiate a very similar, because I was thinking about, I think somewhere in your chapter you mentioned, maybe it was even in the excerpt that Simeon read, about, this problem of someone like Rucker, sort of being accepted, but also rejected on both sides, right? So the Black audience, as you said, is suspicious of him, or at least some part of it is. The country audience is suspicious of him, or at least some part of it is because he's Black, et cetera. And it's sort of like this rock and hard place kind of situation that I think Jimi Hendrix also experienced. And it's interesting that, they both in their ways have tried to create and cultivate a persona that's trying to kind of create a middle ground, right? And Jimi Hendrix tried to do that with his kind of Black hippie persona that he was developing. And it's always, I mean, both of them obviously succeeded to a very large extent, but they also both, are sort of caught between two different audiences, two different cultural settings, and that sort of thing. But it's interesting because I hadn't thought about, in terms of Jimi Hendrix, I hadn't thought about the sort of Daphne Brooks angle of thinking about that as a kind of self-protection in a way. But that's, so I think I think there are connections between this situation with respect to country music, but in other contexts and other places as well, or other figures as well. The other thing I just wanted to say about, well, two things, one of which maybe is a little bit of a stray observation, but in terms of country masculinity, I think that the sort of tougher, harder, masculine version in country music is also very self-deprecating, right? I mean, it's always about, I'm an awful person, too much time in the honky tonks, et cetera. And so sort of it tends to emphasize kind of the self-destructiveness of that life, right? The hard living country on the road honky tonk, I'm thinking of someone like George Jones or something like that. Anyway, so that's a different, that's obviously not the one that Darius Rucker is trying to hook up with, is sort of, that, as you said, soft shell as opposed to the harder country image. But the other thing I wanted to say with respect to sort of the what's the word I'm looking for here? The sort of I don't know, friendliness of country music or country artists or the Nashville environment, is that, it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, or the example I gave before of, people who, admittedly white people, who are not really qualified by virtue of who they are to be country musicians and yet become accepted as such. And there's an article by a guy named Michael Hughes, I think, who's talking about Peterson's book. And there's in that piece somewhere, I kind of extrapolated this idea that and it may be true in other situations too, but that in country music, the authentic gesture is not being white, being working class, being Southern. It's being willing to portray yourself in the way that you need to portray yourself to be considered a country musician, right? So you put on the cowboy hat, and those gestures of kind of remaking yourself into something that the country music audience wants you to be becomes authentic in itself, even though the product is intrinsically inauthentic. So I think I don't know if that's I don't know. I don't know if that's distinctive of country music or if that could be happening in other places as well. But it's an idea that really stayed with me with respect to country music and sort of the process by which people who, you know, on paper don't belong there, nevertheless can still find a way of being accepted or finding a space for themselves.
No.
So to finish up our conversation, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Professor Auslander, maybe you could give us your final thoughts. What does the future of so-called country, formerly hillbilly, then country and western, now country music look like?
Well, I think one of the things that it looks like is that it's becoming, I mean, if you just think about it, I suppose more or less in musical terms, it's becoming somewhat more dispersed because there are now adjacent genres like Americana, for instance, that's taking up a lot of what otherwise might be called country music that doesn't necessarily sit all that comfortably in Nashville and in that particular context. And it's also just giving more people, you know, opportunity. So I think that's part of it. I think Professor Royster mentions in her book a sort of, and I think mentioned here also, you know, that country music, at least in some instances, there's starting to be more kind of visible hybridization of country with other genres and performers who are sort of carrying that forward. So I think that's also part of it. Whether or not that will ever, you know, sort of really redefine what country music is according to the Nashville establishment, I don't know. That's an extremely conservative and very difficult, you know, entity to deal with. And it's, you know, not clear how open to change it is. And I was also just reading recently about country radio and how just to say it, how bad that is with respect to you know, giving exposure. I mean, I was always very struck. I used to swim in a public swimming pool every summer here, where they would play country music on the radio, and they would play a station as a country radio format called The Bull, appropriately enough, because it features no female performers. I mean, I was listening all summer long, and there's just no women on this included in this format, right? Country music is men. That's it. So that kind of thing, I think, is going to be really, really hard to kind of change. But encouragingly, I looked this slightly different point, but I looked at the question of whether Taylor Swift had any impact on country music while she was in country music. And the answer is yes. Apparently, as a result of Taylor Swift and her massive success, the country music establishment has become more open to young performers, which previously they weren't, and to performers who write their own songs, which previously was not really the case. So you know, I guess success breeds success, and I suppose that if somebody, you know, coming out of this sort of gradual change or making alternative identities available within the context of country music, maybe Darius Rucker, you know, is so successful, then that may, in a sense, force a change and force people in Nashville to kind of reconsider what they've considered to be appropriate to this point.
Okay. Professor Royster, what's the future of country music look like to you?
Well, like Phil, I really look a lot to Americana and kind of the roots music kind of movements as places to think about what's happening outside of the kind of most narrowly defined aspects of the country music genre, and to really think about how these forms, you know, they've always been influencing each other, depending on, you know, are you talking about hip hop, or are you talking about cosmopolitanism, or, you know, other even outlaw music, I think, is actually a hybrid of, you know, blues and country and rock. So or sometimes. So yeah, I think about I don't really know. I hope for the future, a future of country music that's more inclusive, that's less corporate driven, though there's nothing in our culture that would make me think that corporations are going away anytime soon. But I do think about, like, the case of Little Nas X and how while he is not like a self-defined country music singer, he was able to make it an impact on country music and its scene and get people talking and thinking through not by getting a major record label in Nashville, and not by securing a certain number of plays, by country music DJs, but through self-distribution, through Reddit and Instagram, and getting the attention of influencers and TikToks. And, part of that, social media world is kind of unknown. It feels like another generation. It is another generation from me, but I do feel like, he is offering a blueprint for how people can make music and have it listened to that surpasses some of the more conservative parts of the music industry. And so, maybe, thinking about these alternative ways of making music will just open up the sound and get more people on stage. And also, I think that, social media is a powerful way to inform the public and perhaps to create a listenership that wants a variety of sounds and variety of people and stories and country. So that makes me hopeful.
Okay, let's see how we can get the book. Here it is. It's by the University of Texas Press. Black Country Music. There it is for $24.95. You can also get the digital version. I'll put that here. So that's University of Texas Press. And let's see how we can stay in touch with Professor Royster. There it is. It's DePaul College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. There is her email, froyster@depaul.edu. Professor Royster, can participants reach out to you with their questions and comments?
Yes, please. I would love that. And they can also, find me on Instagram and Facebook. That's pretty much the limit of my social media, but I always answer my emails.
Fantastic. So feel free to reach out to Professor Royster at froyster@depaul.edu. Here is Professor Auslander at thegeorgiatech.edu, and his contact is right down there. It is auslander@gatech.edu. Professor Auslander, can participants reach out to you with their questions and comments?
Absolutely, always. And my limit of social media is Facebook. I'm not even on Instagram or Twitter. Anyway, but yeah, Facebook or email.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much to Professors Royster and Auslander.
Thank you. This has been just such a great conversation. I appreciate it, Simeon and
Yeah,
Phil.
thanks for inviting me.
So let's take a look at what's coming up next Wednesday. I can get this over there.
That's still me.
There it is. Okay, there we go. So we have the Otto Edelman Society, a monumental voice, or simply a monumental moment. The 20-year-old Otto Edelman debuted as a bass baritone in Germany in 1937 and continued his singing career until he was called for duty just 3 years later. Surviving conditions as a Russian prisoner of war that few ever mentioned thereafter, Edelman made his way home to a devastated Austria and used his voice to uplift those living in the newly formed Second Austrian Republic. He soon became a leading voice in the ensemble of the Vienna State Opera, where he sang 430 performances, 36 roles, and 30 operas, and represented Austria as a star opera singer in Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Milan, and New York. When he took his final bow, he dedicated the rest of his life to training young singers at what is today the University for Music and Performing Arts Vienna, and by giving master classes. It only makes sense that since 2006, the Otto Edelman Society was founded in Vienna in his honor. The society keeps the memory of the late Kammersänger alive by producing concerts that allow young singers to introduce themselves to critical audiences and network with established singers by hosting discussion rounds about critical issues concerning the classical music industry, and by organizing the flagship International Otto Edelman Singing Competition together with the University for Music and Performing Arts Vienna, his alma mater. Let's speak with Sylvia Saavedra Edelman, Managing Director of the Otto Edelman Society, and get to know what happens when a monumental voice meets a monumental moment. As always, all information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmora.com. Again, that is the Otto Edelman Society. I'd also like to point out to you that it's now possible to support Vienna Live by going to the Support Vienna Live Now function on the webpage, and you're able to support by different ways of donations. Your support is greatly appreciated. Once again, thank you so very much to Professor Francesca Royster and Professor Philip Auslander. Thank you very much to Victoria and Frederick Mulligan for the support of this show. And thanks most of all to you, our participants, who make it all worthwhile. From New London, New Hampshire, Atlanta, Georgia, and Chicago, Illinois, goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.